So Gita read out a little bit the definition of transformative change, and I found that a little overwhelming, trying to think about what's a narrative of transformational change, and have I seen anything that's so holistic, that's at every level, that's like enabling new thinking? I don't know. But I think in the context of AWID's work, what I think about in terms of how we try to contribute to something that can be transformational change is more like a spark plug. It's a little bit the combustion, the helping contribute, and also that sense of it's not a process that we can really plan out or map or know how will work, but we kind of rely that with a little bit of spark or fuel, something can happen creatively that we're not going to be able to control, but hopefully we can bring together a good mix of factors. Because we define ourselves as a movement support organization. So we're not on the ground in the streets, but we do have a role to play in terms of helping bring in resources or information or bringing people together. So, and contributing to that broader process. So with that spark, when I'm trying to think around what are some of the moments that have felt really transformative that I've witnessed, it's always been about coming together in some way, kind of a colliding of galaxies of people, bringing differences together in a room that creates really new energy. And that also ends up being, I think Anuka was speaking to the heart, it always includes some level of personal connection as well. So often it's when we don't expect it. It's around music. It's on like the trips out for dinner, when there are really artistic expressions that bring people together in a way that we can actually really connect and speak to each other and understand what we're trying to do, working on the problems that we're facing as really key. Something else that's been important in terms of the kinds of spaces that we try to create for coming together is some level of safety and feeling kind of open to be able to engage and allowing for that real level of personal engagement and connection. So, but if we come together and we do that quite a bit, how do you then even connect that? So how are we connecting the dots? Finding ways of doing follow-up. I was reading an interesting article on the way here about sustaining change over time and really what it does take in terms of an extended accompaniment process and making relevant linkages between groups that are trying to do common work. But for me, the connecting part is also, a lot of what we had been reading was really questioning the idea of organizations. And I mean, of course, NGOization, we have all those questions. But for me, what's really interesting in the connecting piece is we do have to structure somehow. Like, how are we trying to organize what we're doing and the connections that we're making to each other? So, I mean, I think we try different things, but for me, that whole point of how do we structure the ways that we're bringing our resources and thinking together that are consistent with our values is really key. And trust in all of that is a big part of it. So it's one thing to be able to come together, to have some initial connections, but what are the opportunities for really going down deep? In that, because as was said, I mean, these kinds of processes are always going to generate conflict, and hopefully they do, because too often we're coming together, we're assuming either we're activists or we're feminists or and we're going to think alike, and we're a little reluctant sometimes to say, actually, I don't agree with what you just said, and here's why. So we assume that there's this level of agreement that there's not. So how do we have the trust together and in a space to allow that kind of conflict to emerge and hopefully really inform what we're doing. And also then to be able to, I think, be really explicit and build on the values that we are trying to work from and that will hopefully help us sustain those connections over time. And finally, I mean, I've also put power in the slide, but I put it as a shell game. Because even if challenging power is kind of what I think it's all about, one of the things that we've been reflecting a lot on recently is that even as we are building power, we're using power, we're challenging it, it's constantly shifting and adapting. And it's like this shell game where we're in a moment, oh, we think it's the national governments, or we think it's the United Nations. And actually now look at what the private sector is doing to really influence some of the spaces. How are we able to kind of follow that and move and adapt to be able to address the powers that we want to transform? That's it.